Welcome to the Ottawa Business Journal's live broadcast of AI Legal Risks, What Employers Need to Know. I'm Michael Curran from the Ottawa Business Journal. We are live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and other platforms with hundreds of registered viewers today. So thank you for registering in advance, and for the others might be popping up on your smartphone or your desktop computer. Today's broadcast is part of an ongoing series of live events brought to you by Emond Harnden on employment and labor law. And we've got a topic today that really is on everyone's minds: the arrival of artificial intelligence and what it means for business, specifically employment law. As many technology pundits have observed, this could be the most disruptive technology that we've ever experienced. Some suggest it'll be far more disruptive than the internet itself. Hard to believe, but likely true. With so much uncertainty, we can be certain of this: the advancement of technology and AI will continue. You can't roll back the hands of time and stop this or slow it down. It will continue. So the question really isn't how we stop it, it's how we adapt. And we're here today to speak about AI, of course, in an employment law capacity. There's lots of people using AI today for all sorts of HR purposes. And OBJ is happy to be working with the employment law experts at Emond Harnden, a boutique law firm headquartered right here in Ottawa. And we're welcoming back one of its employment law associates. Please welcome Zoriana Priadka. Hey, Zoriana.
Good morning.
Good
Thanks for having
morning.
me.
Yeah, good morning to you, and thank you for coming back. We really do hit some great topics here, by the way. And AI, Zoriana. I always joke, if you get three business people, you should set your stopwatch, because within 60 seconds, this conversation will turn to AI. And the CEOs and business owners I'm bumping into, Zoriana, they are using AI and thinking about its application in HR. For example, some people might, and this is a dangerous thing, Zoriana, as you know more than I, thinking that they can draft contracts, for example, employment agreements with it. Is this something that's starting to become an ongoing conversation with your colleagues and clients?
No, absolutely. It's definitely a timely question, and we have a lot of clients who are asking us. They're thinking about introducing AI into the workplace, and they don't quite know how to go about doing that, and they're not sure about the considerations. And there's so much to consider. There's so many benefits to AI, efficiency, cost reduction, so many good things about it. But there are also a lot of implications in the workplace, especially. We're looking at employment and labor considerations, privacy, intellectual property, human rights. There's so many things to consider before you implement these potentially cost-saving measures in the workplace. So there's definitely a lot we can talk about. The law is changing. Lots happening quickly. But for the purposes of today, we're focusing on sort of three areas in terms of what employers should know when considering AI in the workplace.
Well, that's a perfect transition, just like you've done it before. So, as we often do, we've organized today's live broadcast into three topics, and we'll bring them up here on screen. Topic number one, which we'll jump into in just a second here, Zoriana, is accuracy of AI-generated information. That's going to be one that interests me a lot. In topic number two, we will look at privacy issues. And topic number three, recruitment and retention. In our final segment, sometime around 12:25, we're going to go to our live audience for questions. So if you're on YouTube or if you're on LinkedIn or any other platform, you can use that platform to ask questions, and we'll be screening those and pitching them at Zoriana sometime again around 12:25. But don't wait. If you got questions, if something occurs to you, write it as we go. So without further ado, Zoriana, we're going to jump into our first topic, which is the accuracy of AI-generated information. Over to you.
Yeah, and I think this is a great place to start because for all the benefits of AI, there's certainly the most obvious downside, which is it's not always accurate. And that's definitely something to keep in mind if you are implementing it into the workplace by whatever means. You have to realize that AI is only as good as the data that you're inputting into it for training purposes, and the output may not necessarily be accurate. It may not necessarily be true. So AI can be wrong, and it can be so wrong that there's a specific term we use, which is AI hallucinations. Um, So if we're looking at the example, I think the most obvious one is ChatGPT. These sorts of AI, it's a chat bot, but it's not a search engines, right? So it's a chat bot. It's trained on internet data information that's inputted into it, and it builds a model that essentially predicts the most likely word or sentence or phrase that would come next in a sequence. And this is in response to the user's prompt or question or instruction. So it's very much like a predictive text tool. And since it's not focused on accuracy or facts, then errors can occur. And we call these AI hallucinations. So, these chatbots, again, they're not necessarily focused on determining whether the answer is correct. Its purpose is primarily to provide something that's um, a predictive sequence of words in response to a prompt. So maybe one day we'll get there, but we're not quite there yet. So we need to be wary of AI's limitations when it comes to accuracy. Um, and I think the best example to give in this case is, clients who perhaps ask legal questions online through ChatGPT and come up with answers that are, either misleading or entirely false. And even lawyers themselves have fallen for this. Um, and there's many examples, but one out of New York, actually, there was a lawyer who used ChatGPT looking for case law on an issue, got this great answer, filed it with the court, appeared arguing this case that did not exist, and there were repercussions for that, right? So in this case, it was I believe, a $5,000 fine because the lawyer had to tried to rely on a case that didn't exist, and then opposing counsel in the court is trying to find this case and wasted time and effort trying to do so when the case just did not exist. So there's all these ethical and regulatory issues that may result from using inaccurate AI generated information. Within Canada, an example would be, similar to the New York example, there's a lawyer who used ChatGPT as a search engine, came up with a case that was non-existent and relied on that to their detriment. And in that case, the Law Society of BC actually had to conduct an investigation into that conduct. So there are risks if we're using AI not fully checking the accuracy of the information that it is outputting. And in terms of how this will translate into the workplace, employers should be, cognizant that they would be potentially liable for any sort of errors that are created through this AI generated information. And there's a really interesting example that I'd like to discuss where there was an airline who had a website chatbot. And it's like there's a lot of websites that do this. You'll go on the website and it'll have a little chatbot in the corner. It says, "Hi, how can we help you?" And you input your question and it generates an answer. And in this case, there was a passenger of this airline who was using this chatbot, asked a question about, he was traveling for a funeral and he asked a question about bereavement rates and whether he can apply for this rate retroactively or whether he had to do it before buying the plane ticket. And the chatbot, gave an answer. It provided a link to certain web pages of the airline, and essentially the chatbot said, "Yep, no problem. You can apply for it retroactively." And that was false. That was just not accurate. So when this passenger then tries to apply for this bereavement rate after already having traveled, the airline's employees had to notify him that, no, this you can't do that. We essentially were, you've lost out on this bereavement rate. And the passenger filed a claim against the airline saying, well, I relied on your chatbot. That should have been accurate. So if it wasn't accurate, it's not my fault. It's the airline. Therefore, I should get the difference in flight. And what's interesting is that the airline had admitted to this passenger that yes, the answer was misleading. They went as far as to say that. But at the tribunal level, the airline had said, well, our position is that we should not be held liable for the information because it was provided by a chatbot. We are not that chatbot. We're not, we should not be responsible for it. And it is an interesting argument to make, so much that the tribunal actually commented on it and said that's a remarkable argument because essentially the airline was arguing that the chatbot was a separate legal entity that was responsible for its own actions. So the tribunal didn't fly with the tribunal. They said that that's not something that we're going to agree with. They found that since the chatbot was part of the website, it was part of the airline's the information that was on the website, it should be responsible for that chatbot, whether or not it's arguing it should be a separate legal entity. And so the tribunal found that it doesn't matter if the information on the website is provided through a static web page or through this chatbot. The idea is the airline's responsible for the chatbot and for the information on the website. So the tribunal found in favor of the passenger and awarded them the difference in flight costs and fees and interest and such. But it's interesting that, it seems like a sort of an innocent mistake that was made, as the airline tried to say, was potentially misleading. Um, but there are real life consequences to relying on, in this case, a chatbot, if the information that the chatbot is outputting is not accurate. So, I mean, the most obvious kind of point here is if employers are using AI in the workplace, you just want to make sure you're double checking, triple checking the information is actually accurate.
For sure. And, I'm just trying to wrap my head around the change. So, 10 years ago, we might have used Google to search for historical fact. And maybe that fact's right, maybe that fact's wrong. The difference with AI is we're actually getting it to do work, right? So it's producing documents, it's interacting with our customers. So there probably are lots of exciting applications, Zoriana, for AI, but we're getting into some of the complexity here, right? Where you can't rely, AI is not at a point where you can rely on it for accuracy. And this
Mhm.
notion of hallucinations is quite frankly terrifying. That it's just making up facts, as you indicated, making up case law. Like
Mhm.
you're like, what is going on here? But it's generative. It's what you said. It's not necessarily rooted in facts. It's generating language in a predictive manner. Hmm.
Absolutely. And think about the way that it's outputting this information seems so authoritative.
Yes.
It's saying, here's the answer. But we
Yes.
need to take a step back and remember we should be double checking. Like if it's
Yeah.
relying on a case, find the case. And
Yeah.
if you can't find the case, question why that is.
Yeah.
It that's just an example, but the idea is we should be double checking. We never know, because this information, this AI, is only as good as the information we're inputting into it. If that information is inaccurate or confusing or there is ambiguity, the output may not also be accurate. So
I
triple
like
check, double
I
check,
like it.
do all
Yeah.
those things.
And it does, like, it presents information to you in such a professional manner. It almost is tricking you to think, well, this must be authoritative. It couldn't
Yep.
possibly be wrong, and yet often it is. So
Mhm.
that's a really good start. We're starting to wrap our heads again around the complexity of using AI. Just a reminder to all of our audience: if a question pops to mind, don't wait. Give it to us early, and you can comment on your platform. So, Rana, we're going to go to our second topic on privacy issues. So, lots to talk about here. Over to you once again.
Mhm. Yeah, another very relevant topic because, of course, the information we're inputting into AI, you have to question what this AI is using it for, what's going to happen with it, and are there any potential implications of that? And that's from a privacy perspective. That could be from confidentiality or an intellectual property perspective as well. But the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario has actually stated that AI often relies on very large volumes of personal information or data that may not be properly protected and may not always be lawfully collected at source. So, for example, if you're inputting a question into ChatGPT, for example, and using personal information to give it context or to ask your question, what is it you what will happen with that information? Where is that going? Who has access to it? And we keep going back to ChatGPT as an example because it's such a good example, but that we know for certain ChatGPT is retaining information you're inputting into it and using it to train the AI to get better and progress. So that information you're releasing it. It's there are consequences potentially of that. Um, and taking that a step further, potentially if you are relying on a response from ChatGPT word for word, for example, and if the response, the output from AI is potentially breaching confidentiality or breaching intellectual property, by using that response word for word, you're potentially, just continuing that breach. So it should give employers pause to see, when we're using this actual information to think about how has it been used, what will it be used for, are there any things that we should keep in mind if with regards to privacy? Um, and this is such a, you know, an important issue that there's even privacy authorities in Canada, Quebec, BC, and Alberta that have jointly began investigating OpenAI, which is the company that began ChatGPT, to look into these allegations about the collection, the use, and the disclosure of personal information without consent. So it's definitely a live issue and something we should be keeping in mind. Um, Beyond that, there's potentially privacy concerns with other AI systems. It's not just ChatGPT. And I know I used the example of the chatbot earlier, but AI is so broad. It's not just ChatGPT. It could be things like, in the university context, an exam proctoring software. So there was actually an example where a university in Ontario did use this AI-enabled exam proctoring software to essentially flag if it thought that students were, potentially cheating. And so what it would do was collect this biometric information, as well as audio and video recordings. It would analyze that and would flag things that it thought was either suspicious or consistent with cheating. And then the instructors would review those flags to determine if this student had done anything wrong while conducting this exam. And it resulted in an investigation by the Information Privacy Commissioner of Ontario because it found that the university's use of this software, it breached privacy legislation. And there are a few reasons for that. So primarily the notice that the university gave to students was inadequate about how their personal information would be used. It was inconsistent. The information was located in a number of documents. It was hard for students to fully understand the information and how it would be used. So the notice was inadequate. But beyond that, the purpose with which the university and the third party had used this information was inconsistent with its purpose that it had stated. So it stated the purpose was to collect information for the proctoring of exams, but then it found that the third party was actually using the information for purposes to improve its services, for training purposes. So the commissioner found that that was also a breach because it was inconsistent with the purpose that it stated it was going to use the information for. And lastly, the commissioner found that there was insufficient contractual and oversight measures in terms of how that personal information would be protected. All goes to show, I mean, there are always going to be privacy concerns when we're either inputting information or using AI-enabled information. Things to keep in mind in terms of how it's being used, collected, and protected as well.
When I initially thought of privacy issues, Zoriana, I was thinking in using AI, we're often feeding it information and prompts. So,
Mhm.
here's some data, here's some more, here's a context, and now draft me something, for example. But I had never considered the biometric aspect. So I know quite often, even in video meetings, for example, people have an assistant note taker, and sometimes it's notes, and perhaps that's okay. Sometimes some of the software though is actually doing facial recognition and determining what someone's how someone's reacting or if they're engaged in that. So I'm thinking now about privacy issues much broader than I told ChatGPT a fact and now I've fed it and maybe
Mhm.
trained it on something. It could mean, biometric information or that. That's quite interesting.
And as
Okay.
this technology develops, I mean, it gets more and more complex, and then also the implications of that become more and more complex. We have other questions coming up because of, new uses or different technology. So again, things are changing quickly, and it's hard to keep up in a lot of instances. So
Yeah, it's a bit of a minefield, and that was topic two, of course. A reminder: we're coming up fairly quickly to our live Q&A session. I do see there's some questions waiting for you. They're pretty tough, Zoriana, so I'll warn you in advance. But
sounds good.
it's always so hard. I'll just emphasize for our legal experts to come on and take some live questions, but we'll get through it. Anyway, let's get to topic number three. This one's on recruitment and retention. Tell us more, Zoriana.
So this is probably my favorite slide, but I'll run through it because I do want to get through to the questions. From a recruitment perspective, there is a new law that is coming into force fairly soon. It's not quite enforced yet as of this morning. I double checked and it's still not yet enforced. But there's Bill 149, which would make an amendment to the Employment Standards Act in Ontario that would create a new requirement for employers to for those employers who use publicly advertised job postings to disclaim whether or not they are using artificial intelligence within the hiring process. So anytime they're using AI to screen or to assess or to select applicants, they need to have a disclosure statement on that job posting saying, hey, we're using AI, just to let the potential candidate know. So again, not yet in force, but it will be soon. So something to keep in mind. Beyond that, something to consider in the hiring process is that AI, again, is only as good as information you're inputting and giving it to do the prompt and to provide a response. So there are potentially algorithmic bias and discrimination issues that we need to keep in mind because, AI is flawed. It's not perfect. And if you are inputting information that is biased or discriminatory, it's going to perpetuate that. So if data is, biased in whatever way, then that will be potentially exacerbating any sort of adverse effect experienced by vulnerable and historically disadvantaged individuals in the hiring process. So something to keep in mind. Um, so if we're using AI in the hiring process, be mindful of whether there are biases, whether it's intentional or not, that could create this, adverse impact on the candidate. So, there are things to keep in mind. An example is that thinking back to that university exam proctoring software, the commissioner's report actually did comment on bias in the report to say that the research suggested that that proctoring software actually flagged individuals with darker skin tones more often, and that students with certain disabilities, they might involuntarily move or speak in such a way that would trigger flagging by that software. So there are a lot of false positives that were created just by AI being faulty. And of course, back to Bill 149, when the law was being created in debates, it was actually brought up that in the hiring process, bias is a huge thing. How do we mitigate against this? And one of the ways is to ensure that we are letting people know that AI is being used. So something to keep in mind in those in that respect. In terms of just to fly through this, any sort of changes to job duties due to AI, I think this is something that a lot of clients are asking us about. They want to introduce AI into the workplace, don't really know how to do so, but they're concerned that if they're creating these efficiencies through AI, does that either eliminate or potentially reduce duties within a position? Does that create any sort of implications in the workplace? Does that trigger anything like a constructive dismissal? So if you are removing an employee's duties or changing their responsibilities or the scope of the work, then in theory, if that change is to a fundamental term of their employment, that could trigger a constructive dismissal. And what that means is that there's a potential risk of damages being awarded to an employee who's affected by AI replacing them, essentially. So, lots of benefits to AI could create automation of a lot of work, but we need to be mindful of the employment implications of that if we are changing job duties because of AI. And just, briefly from a labor perspective, you need to be mindful of the collective agreement and whether there's anything in that that would potentially be a concern. So certain collective agreements might have provisions that impact an employer's ability to use AI. For example, there might be something that limits an employer's ability to contract out work from a bargaining unit to a contractor or a vendor that is trained on the use of AI, for example. There might be provisions in the collective agreement that speak to technological changes in the workplace. So lots to think about and lots to consider when implementing those changes within a unionized workplace. And we would advise to just always consult with the union about how the effect of these changes could be minimized on the bargaining unit, about how the changes will impact the bargaining unit. Provide notice as much as possible of these changes to employees and or to the union, and also train employees on this new technology and carry out certain obligations related to the employees who could potentially lose their jobs due to these changes.
It is a good slide. You're right.
A lot on
Uh,
there.
yeah, it's, I'm going to unpack a little bit before we go to our live question. So the first instance was really interesting to me. Of course, when companies are recruiting, they're typically using job boards. The challenges that I've experienced, and probably others, when you're using these job boards, is you can get hundreds and hundreds of applications. The challenge is that it can take hours, days, weeks to filter through all of those. So I see the temptation here where you could have some sort of AI tool go through all of this and filter it down. But as you're saying, what bias is potentially built into that. So that's fantastic. The second thing is so interesting as well, just about, a lot of business people in the public sector as well, we're trying to wrap our minds around how AI can make us all more effective. But that effectiveness could replace people's duties. If it replaces enough of people's duties, is there a job? Is there a job there, right? And so,
Mhm.
what is the potential impact? I think we've always, as human beings, had this concern that robots, or in this case AI, is going to replace us. But it seems we're inching closer to that, Zoriana.
Potentially, right? And so that's something to keep in mind as well. To some extent, if it really is creating an efficiency, the employers have a right to restructure the workplace and create those changes. It's just there are ways to do that, and there are methods by which that can be done. Um, Keeping in mind that it might trigger a termination obligation and liabilities that stem from that as well.
And
So
just
there are ways.
please go ahead. Yeah. And just to demonstrate how real this is, the Hollywood writers' strike.
Hmm.
As I understand it, a lot of those negotiations were around AI replacing people doing the copywriting for films and TV. Wow. This really is a good topic. Sounds like a minefield to me. So we're going to shift into live questions. And as I'm looking at these, I mean, I'll pitch them at you, Zoriana. I appreciate you're not an AI expert. You're bringing the employment law perspective to AI. You're not the creator of AI, but the first question again. I'll throw these at you, and if it's a no comment, just give me the no comment. The first question is: can we help train AI like ChatGPT to make it more accurate? And again, I think that's perhaps more in the realm of let's ask our friends at ChatGPT. But what are your thoughts?
No, and that's a very interesting question. But we keep going back to ChatGPT, but AI can be
100%.
there are various forms of it. So in theory, if a large corporation were to create its own AI, then
Yes.
absolutely you can feed whatever information you want into that, and then train that AI to be whatever you want it to be. And not to be pessimistic, but eventually we'll get to a stage where AI is going to be training itself, right? So
Yes.
this is potentially a time limited problem, but definitely an
Yeah.
interesting thing to consider.
And I don't pretend to be an AI expert. I have talked to some local AI firms, and I think the where this is going from a business case perspective is ultimately they're going to license AI tools within our companies, almost, I don't know if this is the right word, like firewalled within our own data to use that. So potentially it can be trained with
Mhm.
some information like that. Here's a fundamental question. I'll throw it at you again. I've got an idea if you can't think of anything. So someone's asking the common sense question. Well, when is it okay to use AI then? So
What
we
a
just said
loaded
you can't
question.
use AI in any of these cases. So do you have any ideas? I've got one suggestion, but
Well,
you go ahead.
personally, I feel like if we're not using AI to some extent, we're behind the curve at this stage, right? Like AI doesn't necessarily need to be, using ChatGPT as a search engine. Like there are other ways to go about using it in the workplace and implementing it slowly. But, you know, for what it is, I think it does a great job, specifically ChatGPT. I think it does a great job editing, drafting, writing. But again, you always need to keep in mind and be wary that it may not be accurate. So as long as you're inputting the information that you know is accurate, that is not personal or confidential or proprietary, and giving a prompt to come up with some sort of draft, it's always going to be a first draft. I think it always needs to have that human element to it. Um, but it is a great source of just, it will make tasks much faster. I don't think it's sort of a end all be all. It's not a solution. It's not going to be a search engine. It's not going to hopefully no one's asking you to draft contracts, but that's just me. But there are things it can do that can be really, really great. And I think there are certain industries where it can be used more so than others. but every workplace is different.
I
So
like what you said there, and maybe I can characterize it like this. If your work is a process, maybe use AI at the beginning of that process, but not to kickstart ideas. So I'll give you an example from our world. You might say, "Give me a job description for this type of thing." But do that, don't take that job description and say that's exactly what we're going to use. Just have it kind of kickstart your ideas and then realize that's a starting point. It's not the end point that you're going to present to an employee, for example. Does that make sense to you,
a
Mariana?
1000%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think
Okay.
it's a tool. It's not so much a fulsome solution. It's something you can use, but not rely on as, having it be a replacement for the human element, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe one day, but not now.
Yeah. And just looking at a few other things, Suzanne Sears telling you some great information. She's thanking you. Nice to see you, Suzanne. Or hear from you, that is. And our Little has a question. We'll try this one, and maybe we'll wrap it up here soon. The question is, and I can actually show it on screen here. So it says, if a company deploys a chatbot that uses ChatGPT, does the company deploying the chatbot take on full liability for the chatbot, or could the model, for example, ChatGPT, be liable for false information? It sounds like the chatbot example with the
Mhm.
airline. So, any quick comment on that?
I mean, I'm going to rely on sort of the cop out answer every lawyer loves, which is it depends.
Yes,
It's so fact specific that is there an agreement in place here with the company and ChatGPT or OpenAI in terms of how that's being used? Is it the company that's simply relying on it in some other manner? Like we've seen through that case with the airline that if it's a chat bot on a website that is part of the website, then yes, the employer is liable. But in that case, it was, I believe, a chat bot that was created by the airline. It wasn't an independent sort of, it's not like it was ChatGPT. It was technology created for this website. So, if this company in this theoretical example is using ChatGPT in its pure sense, by whatever means, then I would think the employer is responsible and ChatGPT may itself be responsible as well, depending on what results from it. I think that in the end, the employer should be wary that the liability is probably going to attach to both, if not solely to the employer, which is really the concern here.
for sure. Like, I think it belongs, as you said, on the context. And if you're
Hmm.
going to have a Chat GPT like chatbot on your website, then you better accept responsibility for what it's going to say. If you hired an AI company to do some calculations inside your company and
Hmm.
you paid for this, and there's inaccurate, which is not really an employment law issue, but maybe they are liable at some point. But caution, I guess, is the name of the game. Zoriana, we're going to shift into our wrap up mode, and we've got a slide with some takeaways. So we always like to leave our audience with some specific things to think of. Help walk us through these takeaways.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's some considerations regarding AI in the workplace. Primarily, starting point, always keep in mind it's not always accurate. You don't want to be relying on it without having to double check that the output is correct. And it may not be obviously false, it may just be misleading. So, again, it's a great tool when used correctly, but you want to keep in mind that AI does hallucinate, and you want to triple check that output for accuracy. Second, refrain from using any sort of confidential, personal, or proprietary information when using AI. You want to assume that the information you're inputting is going to be used to train that AI. You're sort of losing out on control over how that information is going to be used in future. So, best practices are don't input personal information if you can avoid it. You also want to be mindful of any sort of potential bias that is being used to perpetuate biases in AI, intentionally or not. And also, you know, that is essentially very true in hiring practices, but also throughout any uses of AI. You want to make sure that the information, you're just aware that it could be potentially biased or discriminatory. You also want to obtain advice about the use of technology, AI technology in the workplace, and any sort of employer obligations in relation to its use and the potential impacts on the workplace. So we had talked about looking at collective agreements in the unionized context or within the pure employment sphere. If you're replacing certain duties in the workplace, how can that be done? What kind of impacts would there be? What's the sort of liability that could flow from that? You also want to outline clear expectations about the use of AI in the workplace to address risks and obligations. Train your employees if you are implementing this new system on how to use it, what to do with it, what not to do with it. And lastly, provide adequate training about the use of AI in the workplace and any sort of risks. So keep your employees informed of, again, the processes you're implementing and how you're doing so. Um, and that's sort of a good sort of starting basis, I think, in terms of implementing AI in the workplace, but everything is so context specific. So if you ever have any questions, if there's any sort of hesitation, I would say reach out to a lawyer that knows employment law, myself, my colleagues at Emond Harden, or others as well. I think it's always important to be mindful that there are potentially risks from an employment perspective, AI or not. Uh, it's always good to have that in mind.
Yeah, and we'll bring up your contact information right now, Zoriana, so people know how to get in touch with you. And just to emphasize, we always kind of touch the surface of these issues. So I think we give people some ideas to think about, but really people should get professional legal advice before acting on any of this. Um, Thank you again, Zoriana. Second time on the broadcast. You did a wonderful job. We have lots of positive comments. People saying this is very helpful to start them thinking about some of the pitfalls potentially of using AI. But as you indicated, and I think we don't want to be necessarily negative about this. There is a role to use AI within your company, but it needs to be done in a very cautious manner.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Zoriana, for joining us today, and hope to see you soon around town. Thanks for joining us. Bye bye.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Thank you to the hundreds of people that have watched. I want to remind all of you that this is live right now, but within minutes, it becomes a replay link. So there will be a replay link on the Ottawa Business Journal YouTube page and on LinkedIn. And I also wanted to remind you that there's an entire playlist devoted to Emond Harnden employment law videos. So if you were to search Ottawa Business Journal YouTube, click on the playlist and scroll down, and you'll see a dozen Emond Harnden videos. So if you thought today was helpful and you're interested in employment and labor law issues, that is a fantastic resource to you. Once again, please use those links, share them with colleagues. So that people can be really as informed as possible. Also, a quick OBJ note, we want to encourage you to visit the obj.ca website every day. That's obj.ca. It's updated pretty well every hour with new local news and information. We've got a great email newsletter called OBJ Today. It's a weekday email newsletter, goes out at the end of the day. There are quite literally thousands and thousands of local business and community leaders that subscribe to this newsletter to make sure that they're on top of everything that's happening in our city. You can also follow, of course, OBJ on social media. LinkedIn teams seems to be particularly popular these days. And finally, if you are watching on YouTube and you want notifications in the future about this live broadcast, what you can do is click the red subscribe button. And then if you click the bell button, you'll actually get a notification when we go live on this. All right, that's all the time we have for today. We want to thank you for joining us and thank our friends at Emond Harnden for all this excellent information. Stay tuned. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye, everyone. Cheers.